like to introduce Carolina Caeiro, who is coming to us from Barcelona, Spain, and Mark McFadden, who's coming to us from Madison, Wisconsin. They'll be presenting RPKI adoption and routing security in the North America and Caribbean areas. Carolina is a senior internet policy specialist at the DNS Research Federation and Oxford Information Labs. And again, as I mentioned, is coming from Barcelona, Spain. Mark is the CTO at an Internet Policy Advisor, a consulting group based in Madtown, for those of you who are Wisconsinites, and focuses on internet infrastructure, standardization, and security. This is Carolina and Mark's first time presenting here at NANOG, and it's a pleasure to have them here speaking with us today. Welcome, Carolina and Mark.
Hi, yes, I'm Mark McFadden from Madison, Wisconsin, and I'll be sharing this presentation with Carolina.
Wonderful, thank you, Mark, and let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so to get started, I wanted to say a quick word about who we are and the research we are presenting to you today. So the team, the organization behind this initiative is the DNS Research Federation. We are a UK-based non-for-profit organization, and our goal is to encourage evidence-based research to help make sense of the DNS and generally help people understand the role and impact of the Internet's unique identifier systems on today's most pressing cybersecurity and cyber policy issues, including questions such as routing security. Our work on RPKI adoption specifically is part of an initiative we are conducting with support of ARIN's Community Grants program. And the goal really of our one-year project with ARIN, which we are actually wrapping up today with this very presentation, was to showcase data on RPKI and routing incidents in the ARIN region. And essentially by collecting and analyzing and providing open access to that data, we're hoping to shed light on the current status of RPKI adoption in North America and the Caribbean, and hopefully encourage greater academic and industry engagement and discussion on current routing security practices. We are not the first, of course, to gather and analyze data on routing security and RPKI. And as a matter of fact, as Steve pointed out, we have two presentations following ours on this very same subject. So specifically where we see our project bringing value added is in providing geographic analysis on RPKI adoption for North America and the Caribbean. That means looking at RPKI adoption for all the countries or geographic areas serviced by ARIN. As part of our project, we have also produced what we describe as an online report or platform with live indicators on the status of RPKI adoption globally in the ARIN region and for the geographic areas serviced by ARIN. So these resources are available online on an ongoing basis, and I'll make sure to pop the link in the chat in just 1 second so that you can all take a look at it. Lastly, if you're interested in playing directly with the data that we have gathered on RPKI adoption, you can sign up for an account on our data analytics platform or DAP.live and do your own analysis there. So we've opened our data sets to the community and really welcome other practitioners and researchers to explore and sort of take a deep dive into the data. Mark, can we please go to the next slide? Very quickly about today's presentation, what we're bringing to you is some of our analysis based on the data that we have collected and processed on RPKI adoption in the ARIN region. We will start off by walking you through our global stats on RPKI adoption and validation results and how the ARIN region is performing as a whole. We will then take a deep dive and look at the dynamics within the ARIN region and introduce some sub-regional trends that we've seen emerge in the data across North America and the Caribbean. We've also taken a close look at invalids within the ARIN region. So we'll be presenting and discussing patterns we are observing when sort of honing in on invalid routes in the ARIN region. And then we'll wrap up with a few words on the methodology that we've used for this project and some of our evolving thoughts about ways to measure routing security. Next slide, please, Mark. All right, so let's dive into some of our results. So what you'll be seeing in the next couple of slides are modified screenshots of our online reports and our live RPKI indicators, which you can also access through our site. And I will say also that all the graphs and stats that we are presenting today correspond to those of October 5th, 2023, which is when we submitted our updated presentation to the NANOG program committee. So speaking to what you see here on the screen, my colleague Mark will talk about our methodology and data sources in greater detail later in the presentation. But just to give you a sense of how we arrived to these indicators, we essentially ingest raw BGP data into our data analytics platform and then analyze the RPKI validation results of observed BGP announcements on the internet. So the first question we set out to explore with our research was, what is the level of RPKI adoption in the ARIN region? So in order to answer and sort of contextualize that question, we started off by looking at what was happening at the global level beyond the ARIN region exclusively. So what you see here is the first indicator we set out to consider, which is RPKI coverage. RPKI coverage considers for each unique prefix origin autonomous system pair observed through our collectors, whether the prefix in question is RPKI protected. So we consider a prefix is protected when covered by a route origin authorization, or ROA, which is a certificate that confirms whether an autonomous system is authorized to originate a particular IP address prefix or set of prefixes. Our global coverage analysis indicates that for IPv4, 46.75% of observed prefix origin pairs are RPKI protected, so slightly less than half. Whereas for IPv6, we observe an RPKI protection of over 50%, more than half, at the global level. Mark, I'll ask that we go to the next slide, please. All right, so we then had a look at the ARIN region, and we found that for IPv4, RPKI coverage stands at 28.18%. So nearly three quarters, a little less than three quarters of prefix origin pairs observed are actually unprotected in the ARIN region. This is well below the global RPKI coverage level of 46.75% that we saw in the previous slide. But this is in part due to the fact that I want to say some 32% of the IPv4 addresses managed by ARIN are not eligible for RPKI. This has to do with legal agreements governing the assignment of numbering resources. So when you factor that in, you actually see that ARIN adoption stats in IPv4 are much closer to global averages. For IPv6, ARIN values are nearly on par with global coverage levels. We found that 52.23% of prefix origin pairs observed are RPKI protected. So that is pretty much in line with the global coverage level of 54.13% shown in the previous slide. Next slide, Mark, please. All right, so the second indicator we considered in our report is validation results, which beyond sort of the level of RPKI coverage tells us what percentage of the observed prefix origin pairs are invalid. So in terms of global validation results, we found that for IPv4, 44.21% of the observed prefix origin pairs were valid. That means that for those BGP announcements, the origin autonomous system was authorized to announce a specific set of prefixes. We also observed 2.5% prefix origin pairs were invalid, meaning that the announcing autonomous system was not authorized to announce a specific prefix or a set of prefixes, and therefore that we could be dealing with either a misconfiguration or a hijack. And 53.26% of the observed prefix origin pairs came back as not found, meaning that no information has been found to validate whether the autonomous system in question is allowed to announce a specific set of resources, and therefore those resources can be said to be unprotected and vulnerable to hijacks. Going to sort of the right-hand side of the screen for IPv6, we see that of the over 50% of prefix origin pairs that are RPKI protected, 2.46% were identified as invalid. Next slide, please, Mark. All right, so when we go on to look at validation results for the ARIN region for IPv4, while nearly 30% of prefix origin pairs are protected, we are seeing 1.77% of invalid announcements, which could be considered high given the relatively partial RPKI coverage in IPv4. And for IPv6, again, the level of RPKI coverage can be said to be on par with global stats, except we do observe a higher number of invalid prefix origin pairs in the ARIN region as compared to the global average. And we will be speaking briefly in more detail about what patterns we are observing around those invalid announcements. Next slide, please, Mark. All right, so now my colleague Mark will show you in a second the sub-regional trends we've identified in the ARIN region. Here, I just briefly want to mention that our online report allows you to view both indicators, so coverage and validation results per country within the ARIN region. So if you go to our site, you can view these comparative charts and see how the different countries are performing. So next slide, Mark. This one is the same point I just made, so we can skip that one. Next, please. All right, and I will also show that the online report or platform that we've developed allows users to perform personalized queries. And here's a snapshot of the interface that essentially you could do an ASN lookup or a prefix lookup and access specific information about validation results, countries impacted, size of prefix ranges, RIRs impacted, among other fields that display in the system. So we hope this is another useful resource for the community. So with that, I will pass on to my colleague Mark to continue the presentation. So Mark, please take it away.
Thanks, Carolina. What I want to do is talk very quickly about some of the regional trends that we found. It was pretty interesting to be able to look at the RPKI data not in a broad way, but drill down to specific ASNs, drill down to specific countries. And one of the countries we took a look at was Canada. It turns out that 37.7% of the routes in Canada have valid VRPs. And the number is slightly lower for IPv6, but as you're probably aware, IPv6 take-up is not that high in Canada compared to other places around the world. What was interesting is that in Canada, the invalids were tiny. If you think back to Carolina's comments about what the global and ARIN averages were, 0.9 is a very small number. And so that means, we think, when we took a look at the actual invalids, we think that in general, there are almost always misconfigurations that disappear when you do a later survey of the data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In the United States, Carolina hinted at what the numbers were. One of the things, of course, is that there's a tremendous amount of legacy address space, which is not possible to do RPKI for. And so that's why the number appears to be low here. In fact, when you take away that legacy address space and deal only with the prefixes that have that are capable of using RPKI, the number comes quite a bit in line with what we see for global addresses, and even larger for IPv6. Invalids, as Carolina hinted at, are right at the average point for the entire region. So that in the United States, it's slightly less than 2% for IPv6, slightly higher than 4% for IPv6. And that's actually pretty impressive given the number of targets in the United States and also the number of opportunities for misconfiguration. It's much more common in the United States to have multiple invalids for a single AS, and I'll show an example of that a little bit later. This last bullet was a real surprise to me. I was expecting the prefix size ranges that were protected to probably be in the range between, say, /24s and /16s. But in the United States, there's an enormous range, and I have a slide to sort of show you that. The Caribbean region was very interesting. The ARIN region in general is incredibly diverse, right? So you have an extremely large dominant economy, you have smaller economies, and then you have tiny economies, right? And in the Caribbean region, the economies are, roughly speaking, of similar size and scale. And what we found was that there were 4 distinct groups of deployment in the countries in the Caribbean for deployment of RPKI. There were countries that are sort of signified in green in this pie chart that had significant deployment. That means greater than 50%. A smaller set of countries that had sort of more moderate deployment, that's the white wedge in this pie chart. And then those with very little deployment, you can see those in the gray, and that's probably the second biggest of the percentages here. And then there's a significant number of countries in the Caribbean that have no deployment whatsoever. And so we found that there were these groupings, and those 4 groupings were pretty consistent. By the way, they were pretty consistent for IPv4 and IPv6, but let me come to that in a second. The only difference really for IPv6 is that the countries where there was IPv6 deployment, where there was little or no IPv4 deployment, had basically no IPv6 RPKI deployment. That's the interesting result by being able to drill down. The number of invalids is tiny, really, really tiny. And when we looked at because the number of routes is actually fairly small, we could actually drill down and see why that was. And because the number of routes in Caribbean countries is small compared to their much larger cousins in North America, the number of valids is small as well. And so the opportunity to get either misconfigurations or attacks becomes small in scale. And the pattern of deployment that we see in the Caribbean is so specific to individual ISPs that the data is suggesting that some ISPs make configuration errors when they're trying to first deploy RPKI. One of the things that we saw over the life of the project is that those invalids over time often disappear. And we think that the reason for that is not that an attack came and went, but instead that a configuration was fixed and redeployed. Invalids in the ARIN region really fit into 3 categories. The first category is that there are a number of ASs covered with a single prefix, but something goes wrong with one of those prefixes, right, in the AS. We see this pattern really often in the data. The other 2 patterns are isolated invalids, and I'll show you a couple examples of those, where a single AS is covered per prefix, but something goes wrong with it. And I'll show you an example of that. And then the third thing that we find in the ARIN region that's really interesting is duplicated records. So where we find more than one AS is allocated to a unique prefix, a really unusual situation. And I'll show you an example of that. Now, one of the things here on this slide is that there's a typo here that 234 shouldn't be there. And let me also say that one of the things we're doing here is anonymizing the data. Nobody is using RPKI for RFC 1918 space, right? But one of the things I wanted to show you was one of the examples in Canada where we found an ISP that was configuring one VRP for every /24 that they had. And so then what we found was that for the first /24, multiple VRPs cover the route prefix, but one is invalid and the other is valid. And so it turns out that in this case in Canada, allocation of all three ranges was to an IP broker. So what we suspect is that there's a leftover configuration that hasn't been taken out, and it's left over from where the broker got the addresses in the first place. Another example is in the British Virgin Islands, and again, let me say that we're not protecting RFC 1918 space. Clearly, what I've tried to do here is anonymize the data. But what we have in this particular case is that for the first 24, one VRP covers that route prefix, but no ASN matches the route origin ASN. And so that too looks like a configuration error and not abuse. It just doesn't really match up with abuse. And in this case, in the British Virgin Islands, once again, we saw this about 3 months ago, and then over time, the problem was fixed, and that leads us to suspect, once again, that it was a configuration error. The third of the patterns I want to talk to is something that happened in Puerto Rico. Here, what you have is an ISP that's configuring one VRP for every /24, and the ASNs are various, so that there'll be different ASNs for each one of those /24s. However, in one of the cases, in an isolated case, the VRP covers the route prefix, but no VRP ASN matches the route origin. So again, we suspect by digging down into the data that this is also an example of a configuration error. One thing I want to say about this is that in each one of these three case studies where we talk about what some of the problems are in the data, you can actually look yourself because the data is public. As Carolina mentioned, we encourage you to sign up and actually take a look at the data, take a look at the dashboards, but you can drill down in the data and actually find the examples of the invalids and do further examination of the ASNs and the origins of the routes and so forth. I want to talk a little bit about methodology, and then I'm going to hand it back to Carolina. In terms of the data sources, we used route views to get the raw BGP data. We used 6 vantage points. You can do more than that, but we felt because our project was really focused entirely on ARIN, getting 94% coverage would give us the vast majority of the ARIN region. We used Routinator, and we really like Routinator for route origin validation. And then we used the RIR public stats files to do our geo information. And the presentation before the break was excellent, and we recognize that using the RIR public stats files for geo information is going to lead in cases where you have the wrong data, right? You have the wrong location where the AS is actually the prefix is actually being used. But we think that it's close enough in the ARIN region that it doesn't really skew our data. One of the things we did in the entire project was we did cross-referencing with the data that NIST is getting and Manners has got. And we feel pretty confident that even though the source of the data is coming from different places for all of these projects, the information that's coming out and the results seem very close to each other. And so we feel pretty confident about the data that we've gotten out of the system. Let me say one more thing. One of the things that we're doing here, right, is the unit of measure for this presentation is source and destination address pairs protected by a VRP. And that's consistent with the work that NIST has done, and that's consistent with the work that LACNIC did. It's consistent with the work that NIST is doing. We wondered whether or not it would be possible to think about this and think in terms of the total number of IP addresses being protected in routes that are protected by a VRP. So rather than actually counting each one of the source destination address pairs as one unit and measuring on that, measuring instead on taking the size of the prefix and then adding up the number of IP addresses. We didn't do that as part of the project, but we have always been looking for input on whether or not that would be an interesting metric to analyze how well the routing system is protected. And with that, let me pass it back to Carolina.
All right, thank you, Mark. I'll be just very quick so that we have a couple of minutes for questions. As we've mentioned before, our live indicators are available on the DNS Research Federation website at the link that you see here on the screen. We also have a forthcoming blog article with some of the findings we shared in today's presentation, which will be published on the ARIN website. And lastly, I guess I wanted to highlight again that if you're interested in having a direct access to our data sets, you can get in touch with us and get access to DAP.live, which is the data analytics platform that powers our online report, and we can support you in using the platform to run your own queries and produce your own research. So please do get in touch. And with that, I think, we're good to wrap up and open up for questions, if any.
Please come up to the mic. If there are none, we have some online.
I got one online question that comes from Andrew. Yes. So if there is a large portion of North America IPv4 space, which is legacy assignments that are not eligible for ARIN RPKI, how do we, the internet community, get RPKI available to them? Do we need a non-ARIN RIR legacy allocations?
So I don't have I think that's a great question to ask at the mic at an ARIN meeting. I don't have a great answer for it here. I think one of the things that ARIN has been really trying to do is trying to make it easier for legacy address holders to actually join, to enter into an agreement with ARIN. And one of the parts of that agreement is RPKI eligibility. I know from my history with ARIN that there are organizations that have legacy address space that simply aren't in a position to sign up a registration agreement with ARIN because of legal reasons. It has nothing to do with really the address space or the resources that they've been allocated. But again, I think that's a great question. I do think ARIN is trying the best it can to help those legacy address holders and legacy resource holders join in the registry services that ARIN has. But I have no better answer than that.
Carolina, anything else? You want to?
Nothing more online, but my name is Michael Voidy. I'm with the University of Vermont, and I can tell you that I went through this myself and renegotiated my contract with ARIN so that I could do RPKI, converted all my legacy to whatever the new thing is called now that I can't remember, and just had to have my legal team review it. Boom, easy.
Right.
Great. Hey, Carolina, Mark, thank you both very, very much for your time today and coming to be with us. Wish you were here in San Diego with us, but enjoy where you are. And Mark, get me a Stevens Point beer, would you?
You got it.